In Russia, almost half of all households have a dacha, a garden, or a small plot of land outside the city. And of the families who have one, roughly 2 out of 3 still use it to grow their own food. Not as a hobby. For the table. Now picture that where you live. Imagine if half the households in Boston, New York, Chicago, or London had a second place outside the city. And every summer, millions of them went there. Not to relax. To grow potatoes, cucumbers, tomatoes. To put up jars for the winter. That's not a backyard hobby. And it's not a story about hardship. It's an everyday system, one that quietly became part of an entire culture. To understand it, start here. January. Moscow. -18 outside. Someone opens a jar of pickled cucumbers. The smell fills the room. Vinegar, dill, a trace of garlic. This jar didn't come from a store. It came from a dacha. And inside it isn't just cucumbers. It's a whole summer, a family's work, and a memory of the soil it came from. So what is a dacha? Why do millions of Russians still do this? And why hasn't it disappeared, even as the country around it has changed completely? So what is a dacha exactly? It's a small plot of land outside the city, usually about 600 square meters, roughly the size of a tennis court. There's a modest wooden house, a vegetable garden, maybe some berry bushes along the fence, and an apple tree that's been there longer than anyone remembers. It's not a country estate. It's not a farm. Most of these plots were handed out decades ago through Soviet-era workplaces. An engineer got one, a schoolteacher got one, a factory worker got one, and families held on to them. If you're British, think allotments, but with a cottage attached. If you're German, think Kleingarten, but at a scale that's hard to imagine. And if you're American, think of something that doesn't quite have an equivalent in your vocabulary yet. One more thing to know. Russia's growing season is about 110 days. That's it. Whatever you're going to grow, preserve, and eat for the winter, it all happens in that window. Here's what the tradition looks like in practice. On Friday evenings, from May through September, the trains heading out of Russian cities fill up. Not with tourists, with people going to their dachas. About 1 in 5 Russians still spend their summer holidays there. Among those who own a plot, some practically live there all summer, arriving in May, not really coming back until the first frost. Others show up on weekends, do what needs doing, and take the train home Sunday night. And it starts earlier than you'd think. In February, while the snow is still deep, the windowsills of Moscow apartments fill with seedlings. Tomato, pepper, eggplant. Small plastic cups lined up against the glass like a quiet act of faith. By August, it's harvest. And then comes the part that makes it all count. The canning. Cucumbers, tomatoes, peppers, mushrooms, jam. Jar after jar, sealed and carried home to fill the shelves for winter. This is not nostalgia. This is last summer. And the summer before that. But to understand why this system exists at all, you have to go back. The idea of a dacha, a small place in the country, is old. But the version we've been describing, where tens of millions of city families grow real food on a small plot, took shape mostly in the Soviet century. And it came down to a simple mismatch. For much of that century, getting fresh fruit and vegetables in a Soviet city was not a sure thing. The country's large state and collective farms were built for scale, for grain, for staples, not for the tomatoes, the cucumbers, the berries a family actually wanted on the table. Demand for fresh produce kept outpacing what the system reliably supplied. So the state reached for a workaround it could hand out at scale, a little land of your own. Through your workplace, the factory, the institute, the trade union, millions of families were allotted a small plot, usually about 6 sotkas, around 600 square meters. It wasn't designed as a lifestyle movement. It was practical. A family with a plot could grow its own potatoes, put up its own jars, and rely a little less on the centralized food supply. Plot by plot, ring by ring around every city, growing your own food stopped being just a village thing. A city engineer did it too. A parallel food system built 600 square meters at a time. And once you add it all up, the scale this reached is almost hard to believe. At the peak, in the mid-2000s, an estimated 35 million Russian families were growing food on their own dachas and household plots. Not a region, not a class of people. 35 million families. And in those same years, according to data from 2000 to 2006, those small household plots produced almost all of Russia's potatoes, around 92%, more than three-quarters of its vegetables, and nearly all of its fruits and berries. All of that on plots about the size of a tennis court, a patchwork of tiny gardens, quietly feeding a country. And the weight of it didn't fade quickly. As late as 2011, household gardens still accounted for roughly 40% of the country's total food production. These were the peak years, not today's numbers. But for a stretch of time around the turn of the millennium, a huge share of what Russia ate didn't come from large agricultural enterprises. It came from household plots, from families. And then the backup became the main thing. When the Soviet Union came apart at the start of the 1990s, daily life in many cities got harder. Shelves thinned out, prices swung, and what used to be a simple trip to the store no longer was. For a lot of families, the dacha quietly shifted, from a weekend pleasure to something much closer to a lifeline. The plots were already there. So were the skills. So people leaned on what they knew. They planted more, preserved more, and carried it home on the train. A study cited by the United Nations Development Program found that by 1991, around 65% of Moscow families were involved in some form of urban gardening, up from just 20% 2 decades earlier. In one study of 2 typical Russian cities, researchers estimated that roughly 60% of the food people ate there in the early 1990s came from kitchen and dacha gardens. At the time, international food aid was even being prepared for Russia. Researchers later noted that much of it ultimately wasn't needed, in part because so many families were already, quietly, feeding themselves. This isn't a story about a country being rescued by its gardens. It's smaller and more human than that. For millions of families, the dacha was simply the difference between getting by and going without. When the shelves filled back up, you might expect the habit to fade. Mostly, it didn't. Ask people why, and you tend to hear the same few answers. For the generation that lived through the lean years, growing food is muscle memory, a quiet kind of insurance you just don't put down. For people in small city apartments, the plot is also the only piece of the outdoors that's genuinely theirs. And there's pride in it. Ask, and someone will tell you, with complete confidence, that their tomatoes taste better than anything in a shop. A good summer also makes more than one family can eat, so the surplus moves, a bag of cucumbers to a neighbor, a jar of jam to a daughter in the city. And underneath all of it is rhythm. The same beds, the same August, the same hands teaching younger ones what to do. None of this is about being poor. A doctor, an engineer, a professor, they tend their plots too. In Russia, growing your own food isn't a sign of hardship. It's a sign of competence. So where does all of this stand today? Smaller than it was, and still, by any Western measure, extraordinary. Start with the part that's easy to miss. As recently as 2023, household plots, small dacha and kitchen gardens, not big commercial farms, still produced close to 60% of all the potatoes grown in Russia. Around 45 to 50% of the country's vegetables came from the same place. Think about that. Not giant agribusiness. Household plots. Families, on pieces of land the size of a tennis court. But the direction is clear and worth being honest about. The share has been sliding for years. The number of small household farms fell from about 23.5 million in 2016 to roughly 16 million by 2021. The vegetable share that was about 3/4 back in 2000 is now closer to half. Part of that is simply that the shops are full now, and cheap potatoes are everywhere. When you don't have to grow it, fewer people grow all of it. The remarkable thing isn't that the numbers came down. It's how high they still are. You can see the change most clearly in what the plots are for. The older generation grew potatoes by the row. Many of their children and grandchildren keep the same dacha, but use it differently. Outside the bigger cities especially, vegetable beds are quietly giving way to flower borders, lawns, a place for the kids to run around. The plot is becoming somewhere to rest as much as somewhere to produce. It's tempting to read that as something being lost. It's just as fair to call it something being inherited and adapted. For many families, the dacha is still there, weekend after weekend. What it grows is changing. The 2 generations often share the same fence. If all of this still feels foreign, look a little closer to home. Remember the allotments and the Kleingarten from earlier? The West already does a version of this. In Britain, Those allotment waiting lists can run for years. In Germany, the Kleingarten colonies do much the same job. And across North America, community gardens fill vacant lots, while grow your own, eat local, and micro-homesteading have become fashionable again. It's the same impulse, to put your hands in the soil, to eat something you grew, to know where a little of your food comes from. The difference is mostly scale and history. What much of the West is rediscovering as a lifestyle choice, Russia has carried, almost unbroken, for generations, not because it's better, but because it never quite put it down. So, back to January. -18 outside. The jar on the table. It isn't really about potatoes, or savings, or even tradition. It's a summer you can keep on a shelf and open in the middle of winter. From the dacha. It needs no other explanation.